The day Louise Redmond rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, she did so with a broken wagon wheel, a nearly empty coin purse, and a cattle deed that half the men in 3 counties were willing to kill to get their hands on. She had inherited the deed from her uncle, a rough-edged rancher named Louise Redmond, who had spent 30 years building the Red Bluff Cattle Company from nothing but scrub grass and stubbornness. Louise had died in February without a wife or children to his name, and so the whole of his operation, 4,000 acres of prime grazing land, 200 head of longhorn cattle, a small bunkhouse, a farmhouse that needed mending, and 1 deed filed with the Sumner County Land Office, had passed to his only living relative, a 28-year-old schoolteacher from Wichita who had never once roped a calf in her life. Louise was not, by any reasonable measure, a woman who scared easily. She had survived the death of her parents at 19, had supported herself for nearly a decade through teaching, and had once talked a drunk man out of pulling a knife on another drunk man in a Wichita boarding house by quoting scripture at him with such calm authority that he had sat down and wept. But sitting in the back of a stranger's buckboard as the man drove her broken wagon the last mile into Caldwell, watching the flat Kansas plains stretch out under a sky that seemed too large for any human being to reckon with, she felt something close to fear, not of the land. She found the land beautiful, actually, in a stark and unforgiving way that she had not expected. What frightened her was the scope of what had been given to her, and the very real possibility that she was going to lose it before she had ever really held it. She had already been approached 3 times, once by a man named Holt Greer, who ran a land acquisition operation out of Dodge City, and who had sent a letter to her Wichita address within a week of Silas's death, offering her a sum that sounded large until she learned what the land was actually worth. Then by 2 men who had ridden up alongside her wagon 2 days outside of Caldwell and suggested, with the kind of politeness that carries a threat beneath it like a stone beneath shallow water, that she would be wise to consider selling before she arrived in town. She had not sold. She had also not slept well since. The town of Caldwell received her without ceremony. It was a cattle town, a railhead, a place of commerce and noise and dust, and 1 more woman arriving on the trail was not a remarkable thing. The livery man fixed her wheel for $1.50 she could barely spare, and the woman behind the counter at Beal's Mercantile gave her directions to the land office and to the only boarding house that took single women without question. It was at the land office that she first heard Oscar Crawford's name. She had been asking the land clerk, a thin young man named Percy Dodd, about the procedures for registering her inheritance and securing the deed properly in her own name. Percy had been helpful enough, but when she mentioned that she intended to actually operate the ranch herself, or at least to find someone reliable to help her manage it, he had paused in his paperwork and looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that was equal parts doubt and something she might have taken for pity if she had been in a more charitable mood. "You'll need someone who knows cattle," Percy said. "I am aware of that," Louise replied. "Someone who knows this particular land, the water situation, the grazing patterns, which buyers to trust and which ones'll rob you blind. Also aware. You might try Crawford," Percy said, going back to his papers. "Oscar Crawford. He's got a small operation about 6 miles west of your property line. Knows this county better than any man alive, I'd say. Knows cattle the same way. He won't be easy to approach, I'll warn you." "Why not?" Percy set down his pen and considered the question as if the answer was too complicated for a quick answer. "He's been on his own a long time," he finally said. "Came up from Texas about 12 years ago. Lost his well, he had some hard years early on. He doesn't take partners. In business or otherwise, not for a long while now. People have asked. He always says no, but you could try." Louise had filed the paperwork, walked out into the bright Kansas afternoon, and stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk thinking about a man who said no to everyone and wondering what it would take to make him say yes. She found out where his property lay from the livery man, who seemed to know everything about everyone within 20 miles, and she rode out the following morning on a borrowed roan mare, the deed tucked into a leather satchel, the Kansas wind pulling at the brim of her hat as she crossed the open prairie. The Crawford place was modest from the outside, a solid house, not large, built low against the wind, with a good barn and a series of well-maintained fenced pastures running out behind it. The fence lines were straight. The posts were solid. The gate she opened to ride through moved smoothly on its hinges. Louise noticed these things because she was trying to learn what she could about a man before she met him, and what the fence lines told her was that he was precise, patient, and not given to shortcuts. He was at the far end of the nearest pasture when she rode in, mending a section of fence with the focused, economical movements of a man who had done the same task 1,000 times. He did not look up when she approached, though she knew he heard her. Men who lived alone on the plains did not fail to hear things approaching. She stopped the mare about 10 feet from him and waited. He drove in one more fence staple, tested the wire with both hands, seemed satisfied, and then straightened and turned to look at her. Oscar Crawford was somewhere in his late 30s, she guessed. Broad in the shoulder, lean otherwise, with the kind of permanent tan that came from years of outdoor work. His face was angular, not conventionally handsome, but striking in the way that certain landscapes were striking interesting because of its angles and shadows, rather than despite them. His eyes were a dark, steady gray, and they assessed her with a directness that she found either refreshing or disconcerting depending on which moment she was in. He pulled off his work gloves and held them in one hand. "Help you with something," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, a voice that had not been in a particular rush for a long time. "I hope so," Louise said. "My name is Louise Redmond. I've inherited the Red Bluff property, the Louise Redmond estate to the east of your land." Something moved in those gray eyes. Recognition, maybe, something else she couldn't read yet. "I heard about Silas," he said. "Sorry for your loss. Thank you. He was a good man." She dismounted in a single practiced movement that seemed to slightly revise whatever assumption he had been forming about her, and she stood on the grass holding the mare's reins. "I've come to ask for your help, Mr. Crawford. I understand you know this land and cattle better than most. I need a partner." The word partner produced no visible reaction on his face, but something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a man who has just been handed something he did not ask for. "I work alone," he said. "I know," Louise said. "Percy Dodd at the land office told me as much. He also told me you always say no, so I rode 6 miles out here to understand why before you said it, because I find it's harder to dismiss a reason once you understand it." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's an unusual approach. I'm in an unusual situation." He didn't say anything to that. He walked past her to where a bucket of fence staples sat in the grass, picked it up, and began walking toward the barn. After a moment's hesitation, Louise followed him, leading the mare. "The land is good," he said, not looking at her. "Silas knew what he was doing. Good water, good grass. But it's not a simple operation to run, even with experience. You don't have experience." "No," she agreed. "That's why I need a partner. Hired hands would be cheaper." "Hired hands can be bought," she said. "There's a man named Holt Greer who wants my land. He's already sent letters and men on the road. Hired hands can be offered more than I can pay them. A partner with his own stake in the land's success cannot." He stopped walking. They were at the barn door now, and he turned to look at her again. This time the assessment in his eyes was different, less guarded, more genuinely considering. "You've thought this through," he said. "I've had 2 days on the road with very little else to occupy my mind," she said. For the first time, something that might have been the early ancestor of a smile crossed his face. It was brief, and it didn't quite reach those gray eyes, but it was there. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put coffee on." The inside of Oscar Crawford's house told her more about him than the fence lines had. It was clean and spare, organized with a precision that was not quite military but was close. There were books on a shelf beside the fireplace, more books than she would have expected, And the titles, when she glanced at them as he moved to the stove, were interesting. Philosophy alongside a cattle almanac. A well-worn copy of Shakespeare alongside what appeared to be a surveying manual. A medical text, a Bible that had clearly been read many times. "You read," she said. "Long Winters," he replied, filling a coffee pot at the pump. She sat at the kitchen table because he didn't tell her not to, and she set her satchel in front of her. The kitchen had one window that faced the pastures, and the morning light came through it at an angle that warmed the whole room. For a moment she simply sat in that warmth and allowed herself to feel the exhaustion of the previous weeks, the death, the lawyers, the letters from Greer, the road. He set a coffee mug in front of her and sat across the table with his own, and for a moment they regarded each other across the pine surface. "Tell me about your arrangement," he said. "What you're proposing specifically." She opened the satchel and set the deed on the table. "The land is mine outright. 200 head. The water rights are solid. Silas was careful about that. What I need is someone who can oversee the day-to-day operation, who knows the cattle market and the buyers, who can manage hired hands and make decisions when I'm not there to make them. In return, I'm offering a 20% share of the profits from the first cattle drive, rising to 30% in year 2 if you remain. And we can discuss equity in the land after the first year if the arrangement suits us both." He looked at the deed without touching it. "You're not offering ownership up front. No, neither of us knows the other yet. That would be reckless. Most people in a desperate situation offer everything up front. I'm not most people," she said, "and I'm not as desperate as I may appear. I have enough to sustain the operation for 1 season if I'm careful. What I don't have is time, because Greer is not patient and he has money and influence in this county, and I need to establish that this operation is real and functioning before he finds a legal or illegal angle to use against me." Oscar was quiet for a time, turning his coffee mug in his hands. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a low sound like something breathing. A horse shifted in the barn. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. "I've been running this place alone for 11 years, he said at last. "I know every water hole and every gully between here and the territory. I know which buyers are honest and which ones will short your weight. I know Greer." He paused. "Greer is not a man to take lightly. I know. He's had 2 ranchers in this county sell to him under circumstances that were not entirely voluntary. One of them is working as a line cook in Dodge City now. The other left the state." Louise held his gaze. "I'm not leaving the state." He looked at her for a long, considering moment, and she had the sense that he was measuring something in her, something beneath the words, beneath the sensible proposal and the organized satchel. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy some internal question because he nodded once, a small, precise movement. "I'll ride out to the Red Bluff property tomorrow and look it over," he said. "I'm not saying yes. I'm saying I'll look." "That's all I'm asking for today," Louise said. She finished her coffee, which was very good, stronger than she usually took it, but she didn't say so, and they talked for another hour about the property, the cattle, the current state of the Caldwell market, and the names of 2 honest hired hands he knew who might be available. He answered her questions without impatience and asked sharp, practical ones of his own, and by the time she rode back to Caldwell, she had learned 2 things. The first was that Oscar Crawford was exactly as capable as Percy Dodd had implied. The second was that whatever had closed him off from partnership and from people had left something behind it, a quality of stillness in him that was not coldness but something more like the stillness of deep water, which held a great deal beneath its surface and was not at all empty. She thought about that stillness all the way back to town. He rode out to the Red Bluff property the next day as he had said he would, and Louise met him there. She had arrived first, having ridden out early on the roan mare with a notebook and a determination to see everything she now owned with proper attention. The farmhouse needed work, but its bones were good. The bunkhouse had 4 bunks and a wood stove and a roof that had survived 12 Kansas winters without failing. The barn was solid. The cattle, she had counted 187 head, somewhat fewer than the deed number, which either meant some had wandered or some had been sold before Silas died, were grazing in the lower pasture with the contentment of animals well fed and watered. Oscar arrived on a deep brown quarter horse, a horse that moved with the same economy its owner did, and he spent the better part of the morning walking the property. He checked the fences, looked at the water situation at the creek that ran along the north side, assessed the condition of the cattle with the experienced eye of a man who had spent decades reading the health of animals in a glance, and inspected the outbuildings without commentary. Louise followed him and watched and took notes. At noon he stood at the top of the low rise at the center of the property and looked out over 4,000 acres of Kansas grassland, with an expression that she could only describe as honest respect. The wind was gentle today, and the grass moved in long, slow waves, and the sky above it was the specific deep blue that Kansas managed in spring, and that she was beginning to understand was actually one of the finest things about living in this part of the world. "It's good land," he said. "Silas took care of it." "He loved it," Louise said. She had found letters from Silas in the farmhouse, and they had made her understand him in ways she hadn't when he was alive. "You're about 20 head short of the deed number. Could be drift, could be some sold in December. Silas was ailing by then and may have needed cash. I can check with the cattle register in town. I'd appreciate that." He turned to look at her. The wind was pulling a strand of her dark hair across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand, the notebook tucked under her arm. "I'll partner with you," he said. The directness of it startled her. "Just like that. I said I'd ride out and look. I've looked. The land is worth the work. The proposal is fair. You've thought carefully about the situation, and you're not asking for more than you need." He paused. "And Greer is a bad man who takes good land from people who have earned it. I've watched it happen twice. I'd rather not watch it a third time." "Thank you," Louise said. She meant it to come out as the professional acknowledgement that it was, but it came out with a warmth she hadn't quite intended, and she saw something in his face respond to it. Not much, just a subtle shift, like light changing on still water. They rode to Caldwell that afternoon and had the partnership agreement drawn up by the county attorney, a careful man named Briggs who read every line twice and suggested 2 small amendments that Louise accepted and Oscar did not argue with. The agreement was signed, witnessed by Percy Dodd and the attorney's secretary, and filed with the land office. It was official, businesslike, and entirely proper. On the walk back from the attorney's office to the main street, Oscar said, "You'll want to move out to the property soon. Greer will have heard you're in town, and he'll have someone watching." "I plan to move in this week," Louise said. "The farmhouse needs cleaning and some repairs, but it's livable. I can help with the repairs on Saturday if you need hands." "I can manage," she said. It came out more sharply than she intended, and she glanced at him and saw a very slight lift of one eyebrow. "I'm not entirely helpless," she explained less sharply. "I just don't want you to think you've signed on to mind someone who can't look after herself." "I don't think that," he said. "I offered because the roof on the east side of the barn has a weak beam that needs 2 people to brace properly, not because I think you can't use a hammer." She felt warmth rise into her face and was grateful for the shadow of her hat brim. "Saturday would be fine," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, and they parted at the main street. He to ride back to his own property, and she to the boarding house to pack what little she had brought with her. The following weeks had a rhythm to them that Louise found unexpectedly satisfying. She moved into the farmhouse and cleaned it from floor to ceiling, repaired 2 window panes, had the chimney swept by a boy from town, and began learning the names and temperaments of every animal on the property with the same systematic thoroughness she had applied to learning the names and natures of her students in Wichita. She hired 2 men on Oscar's recommendation, a taciturn but reliable man named Duff Coleman, who had been working cattle drives since he was 16, and a younger man named Tomás Verla, born in New Mexico Territory, whose way with horses was something close to remarkable. Oscar came most mornings, sometimes staying the whole day, and they worked through the practical elements of running the operation with an efficiency that pleased them both. He showed her how to read the condition of cattle in the way ranchers read them, taught her what a healthy animal's coat told you and what a listless one's posture meant, walked her through the water rights situation in detail, and the names of the neighboring ranchers and which of them could be trusted. She fed him breakfast when he came in the mornings. This was purely practical. He had ridden 6 miles before dawn and was generally working by the time most men were still having their coffee, and she was already cooking for herself and had more than enough. But after the first week it became a habit, and the kitchen table became a place where they mapped out the day over eggs and coffee, and something began to accumulate in those mornings that was harder to categorize than the business arrangement they had come to town to sign. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learned things about a landscape by walking through it repeatedly. You did not see it all at once but gradually, and each new detail changed the whole slightly. He had come from San Antonio, where his father had been a cattle buyer and an unreliable one. He had gone up to Kansas on a cattle drive in 1870 when he was 22 and had decided to stay. He had been married once briefly to a woman named Clara, who had died of fever in the winter of 1873, along with the child she had been carrying. He said this plainly, without drama, but the plainness of it was its own kind of weight, and Louise received it the same way, without fuss or excessive sympathy, which she sensed was what he needed. After that she understood the stillness better. It was not emptiness. It was the kind of quiet that grew around a pain that had been lived with long enough to become simply part of a person, not less real for having been integrated, but no longer breaking the surface. She told him things too, though she was careful about it in her own way. About her parents, dead of a fever epidemic that had moved through their part of Wichita when she was 19, leaving her alone in the world. About the decade of teaching, which she had genuinely loved even when it was exhausting. About Silas, whom she had visited twice a year and who had written her letters full of news about cattle prices and weather and the occasional dry observation about human nature that had made her laugh. About how she had opened the lawyer's letter after Silas died and read the terms of the bequest and sat very still for a long time, trying to understand what had been given to her and what it would cost. "Were you afraid?" he asked. They were in the south pasture when she told him this, moving along the fence line in the early morning. "Not of the work," she said. "Afraid I would fail at something he'd built his whole life, afraid of wasting what he'd trusted me with." Oscar was quiet for a moment, working a loose fence post. "Silas was a good judge of people," he said finally. "Better than most. If he left it to you, he had reasons." It was, she thought later, one of the kindest things anyone had said to her in years. Not because it was flattering, but because it was rooted in something real, in Silas's judgment, which she trusted, and in Oscar's own assessment, which she was beginning to trust almost as much. Holt Greer made his first move in April, 3 weeks after Louise had taken up residence at Red Bluff. It came in the form of a legal letter, delivered by a young man from Dodge City on a horse that cost more than most people in the county made in a year, claiming that a water rights provision in an 1878 survey had been improperly applied to the Red Bluff property, and that this was currently under review by a surveyor retained by Greer's Land Company. The letter was a good one, professionally written, specific about dates and legal references, designed to be frightening without being overtly threatening. Louise read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, and rode to Oscar's property to show it to him. He read it once, set it down, and said, "This is nonsense." "You're sure?" "I helped Silas with the 1878 water rights filing myself. The provision is airtight. Greer's hired someone to write a convincing letter, but there's nothing under it." He paused. "That said, he'll file something with the county court if you don't respond. He counts on people being overwhelmed. What do I do? You take this to Attorney Briggs today. You have him write a response that cites the actual survey data, and you send a copy to the county surveyor's office with a request for a formal confirmation. He picked up the letter again. This is not his strongest play. It means he's trying to intimidate before he gets to the harder tactics. He does this first because sometimes it works. But not this time, Louise said. Not this time. The certainty in his voice was matter of fact, not boastful, and she found herself holding onto it like something solid in uncertain water. They went to Briggs together that afternoon. The attorney was brisk and competent and confirmed Oscar's reading within 10 minutes of reviewing the letter. The response was drafted, signed, and dispatched within 2 days, along with the request to the county surveyor's office. The surveyor, a methodical man named Harkins who had known Louise Redmond for 20 years, confirmed the water rights within a week. Greer's man wrote back with a second letter, vaguer and less aggressive, essentially acknowledging the position without conceding it outright. Louise filed the letters with Briggs and went back to the ranch to start the actual work of the spring season. It was during the spring roundup that Louise understood she was in trouble of an entirely different kind than Holt Greer. They had brought in Duff and Tamaz and 2 additional hired men for the week's work of gathering, sorting, and recording the cattle before the summer grazing season, and it was hard physical work from before dawn until after dark. Oscar worked through all of it with the same focused competence he brought to everything, and on the 3rd evening, when they were sitting on the fence rail of the main pasture in the last of the daylight watching the cattle settle, tired in a way that had moved past discomfort into something almost meditative, she looked at him and felt something shift in her chest in a way that was not at all ambiguous and not at all convenient. He was looking at the cattle, one boot resting on the lower rail, his hat pushed back slightly, and the evening light was catching the strong line of his jaw and the gray at his temples that she had not noticed before, and she thought with a sudden clarity that was almost alarming, "I am falling in love with my business partner." She looked away quickly and said something about the condition of the 3rd-year heifers, and he responded thoughtfully, and the conversation moved on, and she spent the next several days being very deliberately businesslike. She was not sure she was succeeding. Oscar Crawford had not allowed himself to feel the particular warmth that was developing in him with anything approaching calm. He was aware of it. He was a precise man, and what was happening in him was not obscure. It was as plain as a cattle count and equally uncomfortable to ignore. The woman across the breakfast table was intelligent, genuine, and funnier than she knew she was, and she worked with a commitment to the land that reminded him of everything he had admired about Louise Redmond, and then some. But he had been alone for 9 years, truly alone, after Clara, after the terrible winter of 1873, and he had built that solitude carefully, the way you built something you intended to hold. It wasn't bitterness. It was more like a decision he had made slowly and lived with long enough that it had become the shape of his life. He knew the risks of what happened to men on the frontier who loved people and lost them. He had been that man. But he found himself riding to the Red Bluff property before the sun was fully up. He found himself thinking about the sound of her voice when she was working through a problem she found genuinely interesting. He found himself fixing the loose shutter on the west side of the farmhouse one afternoon without being asked, because it had bothered him for 2 weeks, and he could not explain why it bothered him except that it was her house and the shutter was loose. In May, 3 things happened in quick succession. The first was that Greer escalated. He sent a man named Teague to Caldwell, a man with a reputation in 3 counties as a lawyer who operated at the edge of legality and sometimes past it. Teague filed a claim in the county court, challenging the inheritance itself on the grounds that Louise Redmond's will had been improperly witnessed, citing a technical irregularity in the notarization. It was a thin claim, but it was filed, which meant Louise had to respond, which meant lawyers' fees she could not entirely afford. The second thing that happened was that Duff Coleman was offered twice his monthly wage by a man he didn't recognize to simply leave Red Bluff without notice. Duff told Louise about it the same evening, his manner suggesting that he was both offended by the offer and entirely willing to stay. She was grateful to him in a way that she expressed plainly, and he seemed to appreciate the directness. The third thing was that Tamaz, who had a genuine gift for staying out of trouble, came to her one morning with the information that two of Greer's men had been seen riding the boundary line of Red Bluff property for 3 consecutive days, not doing anything illegal but making their presence known. Louise laid all 3 of these facts before Oscar on a Friday morning, and he listened to all of them without interruption, and when she was done, he poured them both more coffee and said, "He's pushing because the summer drive season is coming. If he can create enough legal uncertainty and operational pressure in the next 8 weeks, he's betting you'll decide it isn't worth the fight." "He's wrong about that," Louise said. "I know," he was looking at her across the table, "but we need to be strategic, not just stubborn. The Will Challenge Briggs needs to take that apart properly, and he can, but it'll cost time and money. The boundary riders are a harassment play. The best response is to ignore them as long as they don't cross the line. And Duff staying is important. It signals that your people are loyal." "He stayed because he has principles," Louise said. "But also I think he's genuinely angry that someone tried to buy him, and Duff doesn't forgive that kind of thing easily." "Good." A pause. "I'm going to Dodge City next week to talk to the cattle buyer I work with, Elias Penn. He's honest and he has volume. If I can get him to commit to a purchase contract for your summer drive, it takes away Greer's ability to interfere with your market." She looked at him. "That's your relationship with Penn. You're using it for my benefit." "Our benefit," he corrected. "I'm your partner, Louise." It was the first time he had called her by her first name. They both noticed it. He didn't apologize for it, which she respected, and she didn't make anything of it in the moment, which he noticed and also seemed to appreciate. "Our benefit," she agreed. "Thank you." He went to Dodge City the following week and came back with a signed purchase agreement from Elias Penn for 100 head at a solid per-head price, delivery in August. It was a genuine breakthrough, and Louise was so genuinely relieved that when Oscar rode in with the news and handed her the contract across the kitchen table, she grabbed his hand in both of hers and squeezed it with a fervor that was entirely unplanned. He went very still, the way a man goes still when something touches him that he wasn't prepared for. She released his hand after a moment. "Sorry," she said. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize," he said. His voice was quiet and even, but something in it had changed, like a key turning. They looked at each other across the table for a moment too long to be purely professional, and then Louise stood up and said something about coffee and moved to the stove, and the moment passed, but it did not go away. It sat in the room with them through the rest of the morning, present and unaddressed, like a question that both people knew was there and neither was quite ready to ask. June arrived with heat and the long days of early summer, and the Red Bluff operation was genuinely coming together. The cattle were in good condition and gaining well on the summer grass. The legal challenge to the will had been systematically dismantled by Attorney Briggs, who had found the notarization irregularity to be non-existent upon proper examination, and the boundary riders had stopped appearing after 2 weeks of being studiously ignored. Greer was not finished, but he was quieter, reassessing, and the quiet was almost more uncomfortable than the activity. Louise knew this from her years of dealing with difficult people. The silence before the next move was its own kind of pressure. She was in the barn late one afternoon when Oscar came in to help her with the evening feeding and found her reading one of the letters Silas had written her several years ago, which she had brought out to the property and kept in a small wooden box. She had found it that morning and sat with it at the workbench, reading it in the dusty afternoon light. He paused in the barn doorway when he saw her expression. "Something wrong?" he said. "No," she said. "Reading Silas's letters." He wrote me one in 1879 that describes this land in September. He said the grass in September had a quality of light in the late afternoon that he could never find the words for, but that it was the finest thing he'd seen in 30 years of looking. She looked up at the barn roof. I want to see that. I want to be here in September and see what he meant. Oscar was quiet. Then he came and sat on the workbench beside her, not looking at the letter but sitting close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the barn's dim interior. You'll see it, he said. The grass does something in September here. The angle changes. He was right that there are no adequate words. She turned to look at him. They were very close. Have you never thought of leaving? She asked, after everything that happened here, after Clara. He considered it honestly the way he considered most things. Once, he said, the spring after she died, I loaded the horse and rode north for 2 days. Then I came back. A pause. I didn't understand why at the time. I think now it was because the land already knew me and I didn't have to explain anything to it. Louise looked at him for a long time. Oscar, she said. Louise, he said. And nothing else was said, but everything was said, and she reached up and touched his face with her hand very gently, and he turned into it almost involuntarily, and then he covered her hand with his, and the barn was warm and the cattle were quiet outside. And for a long moment they were both simply present in that moment together, not running from it and not pretending it wasn't there. He said, I have not been good at this. For a long time. I know, she said. I know you haven't. That's not a thing that fixes quickly. I'm not asking for quickly, she said. I'm asking for honestly, that's all. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and what was in them was complex and real, and not at all the face of a man who didn't feel things. It was the face of a man who felt them very much and had been careful for a long time, and was now, in this barn, in this Kansas evening, being asked to be less careful. He leaned forward slowly and kissed her once, with a quietness that was entirely like him, and she kissed him back with a warmth that was entirely like her, and the horses shifted, and the late sunlight came through the barn's high window and lay in long gold bars across the floor. They did not speak for a while after that. They did the evening feeding together, moving around each other in the familiar barn space with a new quality to the silence between them, something that had opened up and was now simply present, not requiring words. When Oscar rode back to his own property that evening, Louise stood at the farmhouse door and watched him go until the dark swallowed the shape of him, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the pine surface and smiled at the wall for a while. Greer moved in July. The move was more sophisticated than his previous attempts. He had apparently spent 2 months researching and had found an 1876 county tax record that showed a brief discrepancy in the Red Bluff property's assessed value. A clerical error, as it turned out, but one that an unscrupulous legal mind could present as evidence of a fraudulent property filing. Teague filed a new challenge with the county court, this one aimed not at the will but at the original property deed, and the language of the filing was technical and specific, and designed to take months to resolve, during which time the property might be subject to a legal freeze that would prevent Louise from conducting the summer cattle drive. Louise read the filing at Briggs' office and felt cold. Briggs was sober about it. It's beatable, he said, but it will take time and it will require someone who was present at the original 1876 filing to testify to the circumstances. Who filed it originally? Louise asked. A man named Henderson, who was the county assessor in 1876. He died in 1880. The cold deepened. Is there no other record? There's one, Briggs said carefully. The survey notes from 1876 were made by a surveyor named Walter Crane. He's retired now, living in Wichita. If he can confirm the clerical error and testify to the legitimate nature of the original filing, it defeats the challenge entirely. Louise was back at Red Bluff by evening, and she told Oscar everything over dinner in the farmhouse kitchen. He listened, asked 2 precise questions about the timeline, and then set down his fork and said, I'll ride to Wichita. Oscar, it's August in 6 weeks. If this isn't resolved before the drive, we can't sell. If we can't sell, Greer can let the legal process drag until you run out of money to maintain the operation, and then he buys it at a loss price. It's a 5-day ride each way. I know how far Wichita is. He looked at her steadily. I'll be back in 12 days. She looked at him across the dinner table and felt something that she recognized as both gratitude and fear that he was riding away, fear that felt disproportionate and told her something about how much space he had taken up in her life in the months since she had first ridden to his fence line. "Be careful," she said. Something warm moved through his expression. "I'll be back," he said, as if he understood that the careful was not only about the road. He left in the early morning 2 days later, and the 12 days he was gone were the longest of the Kansas summer. Louise ran the operation, managed Duff and Tamaz, dealt with a sick heifer that needed treatment, and a fence breach in the north pasture that required 2 full days to repair. She rode in the evening by lamplight, something she had always done, more journal than diary, a record of the day's work and thought, and found that her writing kept circling back to the same subject, which was a man with gray eyes and a precise way of doing things, and a quality of stillness that she had come to understand was not distance but depth. He returned on the 11th day, a day early, riding in through the east gate in the late afternoon with the dust of the road on him and Walter Crane's signed affidavit in his saddlebag. She came out of the house when she heard the gate, and when she saw it was him, she crossed the yard quickly and he swung down from his horse and they stood close together, and she put her hand on his chest and he covered it with his and they looked at each other in the warm afternoon light. "You found him," she said. He remembered the 1876 filing perfectly. He said the assessor Henderson made the clerical error himself, and Crane caught it and noted it in the survey log at the time. He was happy to say so in writing. He said he was glad someone was fighting Greer. A pause. Apparently Greer tried to acquire Crane's son's property in 1880. Crane's son sold because he didn't have the resources to fight. Crane has felt badly about it since. "Justice has odd timing," Louise said softly. "It does." He was still holding her hand against his chest. "You managed all right while I was gone." "I managed well," she said firmly, because it was true and because she wanted him to know it. "Though I am very glad you're back." He looked at her, and whatever he had been holding back, and she understood now that he had been holding something back, not from dishonesty but from the careful habits of a man who had been hurt and had protected himself accordingly. Whatever it was present in his eyes now in a way it hadn't been before he left, as if the ride and the days away had clarified something for him. "Louise," he said. "Yes," she said before he had asked anything. He smiled at that, a full smile, the first time she had seen a full one, and it transformed his face in a way that made her understand she had been seeing only a portion of him all this time. "I haven't said what I'm asking," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I think I know what it is, and the answer is yes." He kissed her in the yard in the afternoon light, properly this time, with both hands on her face and nothing held back, and she kissed him back with everything she had. And somewhere in the nearby pasture, one of the horses made a sound of complete indifference, which made her laugh against his mouth, and he laughed too, and the sound of it rang out across the Kansas grassland like something that had been waiting to be let loose for a very long time. The affidavit arrived at Attorney Briggs' office on a Thursday morning, and by Friday Briggs had filed the formal response to Teague's challenge with a precision that left no angle unaddressed. The county judge, a measured man named Foster who had been on the bench in Caldwell for 16 years and had seen plenty of Greer's maneuvers, reviewed the case over the weekend and issued his finding on Monday morning. The challenge was dismissed. The Red Bluff deed stood exactly as it had always stood. Holt Greer's man Teague left town on Tuesday. Greer himself sent a final letter, not through an attorney this time, but under his own signature, brief and without apology, indicating that his company was no longer pursuing an interest in the Red Bluff property and wishing Miss Redmond continued success with her operation. It was the kind of letter a man wrote when he had run out of angles and knew it, and Louise read it at the kitchen table with a satisfaction so complete it felt almost physical, and then she set it in the fire and watched it burn. The summer cattle drive happened in the second week of August, exactly as planned. Oscar rode point and Duff managed the left flank, and Tamaz was on the right with 2 additional hired men they had taken on for the drive. 107 head, 7 more than the pen contract required, giving them the insurance of a few extra against attrition on the trail, moved out of Red Bluff on a blue sky morning with the grass still dewy underfoot, and the whole prairie smell of summer and cattle and possibility. Louise rode with them. Oscar had not suggested she stay behind, and she had not offered to. She had spent 3 months learning this work, and she intended to do it. She rode well, as it turned out, better than she had any reason to expect, having always been comfortable on horseback from her Wichita years, and she learned the specific work of the drive quickly. By the second day, she was reading the herd's movements in the way Oscar had taught her, understanding the signals of restlessness or calm that moved through the group of animals like weather through grass. There was one rough night, the third night, when a thunderstorm moved in from the southwest after midnight, and the cattle stamped and jostled and threatened to scatter. Oscar was at the front of the herd and Louise was at the rear, and she held her position through 2 hours of rain and lightning, and the rolling anxiety of 100+ spooked cattle, with a steadiness that surprised even her. When it was over and the herd was quiet and the rain had moved on east and the sky was dark and dripping and the distant lightning was someone else's problem, Oscar rode back along the flank to find her, and she was still in her position, her horse calm, her posture entirely intact, wet through to the skin and not particularly bothered about it. He looked at her for a moment in the dark. "Well done," he said. "I wasn't going to let them scatter," she said simply. Elia's pen received the cattle in Dodge City on a Thursday and paid the contracted price in full, in cash, in the office of his company, and shook Louise's hand with the frank respect of a man who had been in the business long enough to recognize competence regardless of the form it came in. The sum that changed hands was the largest Louise had held in her life, and she kept her expression professional throughout the transaction. But on the street outside Oscar's office, she allowed herself one moment of pressing both hands to her cheeks and exhaling with her eyes closed, and Oscar, walking beside her, laughed quietly and said, "All right." "Very all right," she said. They stayed in Dodge City for 2 days, conducting the practical business of the sale, recording the transaction, paying the hired men, purchasing the supplies that would see the operation through to fall, and having one meal at a proper hotel restaurant that felt like a celebration without being labeled as one. Over that meal, with the noise of the dining room around them and the glow of oil lamps on the linen tablecloth, they talked about the fall plans and the coming year and the expansion possibilities that the summer's success had opened up. And somewhere in that conversation, it became clear that they were talking not just about the business, but about a future in which they were both present, and in which the form of that presence had changed from partners in work to partners in something larger. "I want to talk to you about something," Oscar said, when the dinner plates had been cleared and the coffee had come. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in that way he had when he was formulating something with care. "When I came back from Wichita," he said, "and you told me yes before I'd asked the question, I want to ask the question properly." She waited. "I have been alone a long time," he said, "more than a decade without a partner, in the business or otherwise. That was a deliberate decision, not an accidental one. I want you to know that, because I want you to understand what it means that I'm changing it." He looked at her steadily across the table. "You came to my fence line in April with a deed and a notebook, and the kind of clear-eyed stubbornness that I have always found more admirable than comfortable. And in 6 months, you have not once been what I expected and have consistently been more than I was prepared for." A pause. I would like you to be my wife, Louise, if you are willing. And I want to be honest with you that it is not a thing I ask lightly, because I have not asked anyone anything lightly for a very long time." Louise looked at him for a moment. There was everything she had come to know about him in his face: the precision, the depth, the quality of absolute seriousness that was never humorless, the gray eyes that had assessed her across a fence line in April and were now looking at her with something in them that was warm and real and entirely unguarded for the first time. She said, "I'll be honest with you too. I came out here to ask for a business partner, and I had no intention of anything beyond that. What happened afterward was not my plan, but I have generally found that the things that happen outside your plan are the most instructive ones. And what I have learned about you in 6 months is that you are the most genuinely decent person I have met since Sela's, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life in Kansas with you." She smiled. "So yes, absolutely yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, and the noise of the hotel restaurant continued around them, and the lamps burned, and neither of them was looking at anything except each other. They were married in September in Caldwell, in the small white church on the eastern edge of town, on a Saturday afternoon with the particular fall light that Silas had described in his letter making gold of everything it touched. The wedding was small. Oscar's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Bill Garrett who had been something close to a friend for several years, stood with him. Louise had no family left, but Duff Coleman came in a clean shirt and his Sunday hat, and Tomás came with his wife, a quiet, warm woman named Esperanza who brought flowers from her own garden and was so genuinely happy for Louise that it made Louise feel, for the first time, that the family she had built in this Kansas county was a real one. Percy Dodd from the land office came. Attorney Briggs came. The Reverend was a thoughtful man who kept the ceremony traditional and honest, and did not pad it with sentiment, which suited them both. When Oscar kissed her at the altar, it was unhurried and warm and completely characteristic of him, and the small assembled gathering made a sound that was something between a laugh and a cheer, and Duff Coleman in the back pew cleared his throat with an emotional force that suggested he was not as unemotional about the whole thing as his usual manner implied. They had a wedding supper at the hotel and rode back to Red Bluff in the evening, and the drive home was quiet and good, the moon beginning to rise over the flat land and the air cool and smelling of September grass, just as Silas had described it, and it was everything he had said it was. "There it is," Oscar said, when they were on the rise that looked out over the property and the moonlight was doing the thing to the tall grass that the September light did. "What Silas described." "Yes," Louise said. She was riding beside him, their horses close. "He was right. There aren't words for it." They rode down into it together. The fall settled into a domesticity that was entirely new for both of them and entirely good. The farmhouse, which Louise had spent the summer months improving in the margins of the ranch work, was genuinely comfortable now. The kitchen had been properly arranged. The bedroom had curtains that she had made herself from cloth she'd bought in Caldwell, and Oscar's books had migrated from his old property to the Red Bluff shelves in a way that felt like a settling in rather than a move, as if they had been heading here all along. Oscar had rented out his own property for the season to a young couple newly arrived from Missouri, which solved 2 problems at once: income and the maintenance of the land while they determined what to do with it in the longer term. He was practical about it, as he was practical about most things, and Louise appreciated the practicality but also recognized beneath it the deeper fact of what it meant for him to leave the house he had built alone and come to a house they would build together. She told him this one evening, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression that was complex and honest and said, "The house was a good place. But it was quiet in ways I had stopped noticing until I noticed what not quiet felt like." He looked at the kitchen, the fire, the window with its new curtains, the books on the shared shelf. "This is better." December brought the first of the real Kansas winter, and with it, several weeks of staying close to the property, running the reduced winter operation, and the particular satisfaction of being indoors together when the weather outside was serious. Oscar was, as it turned out, an excellent cook, better than her in some technical respects, though she had more variety, and they developed a kitchen dynamic that involved occasional competitive opinions about the best way to make biscuits, and a genuine agreement on the subject of beef stew that formed the backbone of their winter diet. She taught him card games she had learned from her students' parents in Wichita. He taught her chess with a patience that surprised him, because he had never been able to teach anyone chess before. She was, within 2 months, a formidable opponent, which he found both frustrating and enormously satisfying. They read aloud to each other in the evenings, trading off, and the books they chose ranged across Oscar's shelf and a new collection she sent away from a Wichita book dealer, and the conversations those books generated were some of the best conversations either of them had ever had. There were nights of Kansas winter silence, with the wind outside and the fire inside, and the house sealed against the cold, when Louise would look across the hearth at Oscar reading in the firelight and feel something so solid and deep that the word contentment seemed too small for it. It was the sensation of a life that had come into alignment, not without cost, not without the things that had been lost on the way here, but aligned now in a way that felt not like the absence of difficulty, but like the presence of something worth the difficulty. In January, Louise discovered she was pregnant. She sat with the knowledge for a full day before she told him, not from uncertainty, but from wanting to hold it alone for a little while, the way you held something new and precious before you shared it with the world. When she told Oscar at dinner, setting down her fork and saying simply, "I think we're going to have a child," his face went through something that was very like what a landscape goes through when the sun comes out after a long, overcast period. Not sudden brightness, but a gradual, spreading illumination that changed everything by degrees. He stood up from his side of the table and came around to her side and knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his, and he didn't say anything for a moment, and she could feel in the grip of his hand something of what he was feeling, the complexity of it, the old grief and the new joy existing in the same moment, the weight of caring about something again in a world that had taught him what caring cost. "Are you all right?" he finally said. It meant more than the obvious. "I am very all right," she said, squeezing his hands. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, and his voice was full and it was entirely honest. "I am very all right." The spring of 1883 arrived with the full weight of new beginnings. The cattle operation was planning its second drive season, which Louise was managing with the confidence of someone who had now done it once and learned everything she could from the experience. She had also, over the winter, been corresponding with 2 other women ranchers, one in Texas and one in the Colorado Territory, who had heard through the network of the cattle trade that there was a woman running a successful operation in Caldwell, Kansas, and who had written to introduce themselves. These correspondences were among the things that had given Louise the most genuine pleasure of the winter, because they told her something important about the world she was in. It was not impossible, what she was doing. There were others who had done it and were doing it still. She was also honest with herself about the ways in which the world she was in made things difficult for women. The land office men who looked past her when Oscar was there, the cattle buyers who addressed their questions to him even when she was the one who had asked first, the occasional letter from distant acquaintances that still addressed her as if she were a visitor to her own life rather than the architect of it. Oscar noticed these things too, and his responses to them were characteristically useful, not dramatic, not performative, but consistent. He redirected conversations to her. He let buyers know clearly that decisions at Red Bluff were joint decisions. He told the story of the founding of the partnership accurately, which meant that it was always a story in which she had ridden to his fence line and proposed the terms. The baby was born in August, on a hot Kansas night with a wind from the west, and the cattle quiet in the pastures. Esperanza Verla came to the house 3 days before the birth and stayed through it, and her presence was steady and warm and deeply practical in ways that Louise was grateful for beyond articulate expression. The birth was harder than she had anticipated, several long hours of it, and Oscar was in the outer room, pacing with a control that was very like him, doing his best to be useful by keeping the fire going and the water hot and not coming in unless called. When Esperanza opened the door and told him he could come in, he crossed the room in 4 steps and was at Louise's side, and she was exhausted and damp and genuinely wrung out, and she put the baby, a boy, solidly built, loud with opinion from his first breath, into his arms. Oscar held his son and looked at him for a long time. The child's eyes were the dark and unfocused blue-gray of all newborns, and his face was screwed up with the effort of existing, and his fist, which was absurdly small, was clutching the air with a vigor that suggested he intended to have strong opinions about everything for the rest of his life. "He looks like he's already disagreeing with something," Louise said from the pillow, her voice rough with tiredness. "He'll fit right in then," Oscar said. His voice was the quietest she had ever heard it, which was very quiet, and his face was doing the thing it had done when she told him about the pregnancy, that spreading illumination, except now the sun was fully out. They named him Silas James Crawford, the first name for Louise's uncle and the second for Oscar's older brother, who had died in the war before Oscar had come north. It was a name that held both of them, which seemed right. The second summer drive was even more successful than the first. Oscar had used the winter to scout additional buyers and had opened a second contract with a buyer named Farquhar who operated out of Kansas City, giving them market flexibility that the first season had lacked. Louise had spent part of the winter reviewing the land's capacity and had determined that they could expand the herd by 30% over the next 2 years without overgrazing, a conclusion that Oscar agreed with, and that they had already begun implementing by acquiring 17 additional young stock in the spring. Duff Coleman had become, in the course of the year, something between an employee and a fixture, a man so thoroughly embedded in the working life of Red Bluff that the idea of the place without him was genuinely difficult. He had, in the previous winter, built himself a small addition to the bunkhouse with his own time and materials, a private room where he kept his few books and his late mother's photograph, and Louise had not said anything about the addition except that the construction looked solid, which was her way of saying he was welcome to stay as long as he liked, which was understood. Tomás and Esperanza came to the property regularly, and were, in every practical sense, friends rather than merely employees, people at whose table you ate and who ate at yours, which in Louise's understanding was the definition of friendship in any era or geography. Their children, they had 2. A boy of 4 and a girl of 2 played in the yard when they came, and baby Silas, propped in his crate on the porch, watched these older children with an expression of concentrated ambition that suggested he intended to join them as soon as physically possible. In the second year after the wedding, Louise received a letter from a woman in the Colorado Territory, the correspondent she had been writing with through the winter. The woman's name was Beatrice Harlow, and she was dealing with a situation remarkably similar to the one Louise had faced with Greer, a predatory land buyer who was trying to pressure her into selling a claim she had legally inherited from her father. Beatrice was alone and did not have the resources or the local knowledge to fight effectively. Louise wrote back immediately with a letter that was practical and detailed, and gave Beatrice the precise legal strategy that Attorney Briggs had used against Greer's challenges, along with the names of 2 Kansas contacts who could help with the cattle market side of things, and a shorter personal section at the end that said simply, "You have more resources than you know, and this land is yours, and people who tell you otherwise are counting on you being afraid to find out how strong you are." She showed the letter to Oscar before she sent it. He read it and handed it back without a word, and kissed her on the top of her head in passing, which was not a gesture he made often and therefore carried considerable weight. Beatrice Harlow kept her land. The third spring brought the kind of moment that lives in the memory as a fixed point, a before and after. Louise was on the south rise, the same rise where Oscar had stood on that first day of walking the property, and said it was good land on a late April morning, and the whole of Red Bluff was laid out below her, the house with its smoke from the morning's cooking fire, the barn with its sound of horses and Duff's voice speaking quietly to them the way he always did, the cattle in the lower pasture, the good fences running clean and straight, the creek along the north edge with the willows that were just beginning to come in green, and Oscar coming up the rise toward her from the direction of the north pasture with Silas, who was 8 months old and determined, on his back in the makeshift carrier they had rigged, the baby's face over his father's shoulder bright with the intense alertness of a child for whom the whole world is perpetually new. She watched them come up the rise, her husband and her son against the spring sky, and the moment had the quality of the September grass too full for the words available to describe it, but entirely real, entirely present, entirely hers. Oscar came up beside her and stood looking out at the land. Silas made a sound of strong approval at the view. "He likes the high ground," Oscar said. "He gets that from his great-uncle," Louise said. "Silas was always talking about this rise in his letters." "Good inheritance," Oscar said. He was looking at her when he said it, not at the view. She took his hand. The wind came from the west, warm and full of spring, and carried the smell of grass and the distant cattle and the creek water and the plain, sweet smell of Kansas in April, which was the smell, she had decided, of everything being possible. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. "All right," he said. He was giving her his full attention, the way he always did, that quality of complete presence that was one of the things she loved most about him. "I want to write to the county land office about the availability of the Henderson parcel on the east side," she said. The Henderson parcel was 80 acres of scrub land bordering their eastern fence line that had been sitting in legal limbo since the original assessor's estate had been sorted. "If we can acquire it at a reasonable price, it gives us the water access on the east side that we've been working around, and it puts us at the kind of acreage where we can think seriously about the herd expansion." He nodded, considering. "Penn mentioned there's going to be a strong market in '84 and '85 for well-sourced cattle. The Kansas City market is growing. If we expand the herd in '84 and have the water access to support it, we're positioned for something genuinely substantial," she finished. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said, not a question. "Since February," she admitted. "I wanted to wait until I'd thought it through properly. And it's sound," she said. "The numbers work, the risk is manageable, the land is worth having." He was quiet for a moment, the same considering quiet she had known since the first morning at his kitchen table. Then he said, "Write to the land office." Silas, on his father's back, made a sound that might have been agreement. The letter was written. The land office responded within the week, and the Henderson parcel was in negotiation within the month. The process took until midsummer, but the price was fair and the legal work was clean, and when the deed was signed and filed, Red Bluff officially encompassed 4,180 acres of Sumner County, Kansas, and the east water access was secured. That summer, Louise also had a long conversation with Tomás about his future. He had been offered a position in New Mexico Territory by a cousin who was building a horse operation, and while he clearly wanted to stay at Red Bluff, the offer was a genuine opportunity, and he felt the pull of it. She listened to everything he said and then told him that she and Oscar both wanted him to stay, that his wage would be increased, and his position formalized as ranch foreman, which was a title that reflected what he already was in practice, and that if he stayed through the next 3 years and the operation grew as she expected, there was a possibility of something more substantial to discuss. She told him this plainly and honestly and let him make his decision without pressure. Tomas stayed. The conversation was another small lesson in the management of people that Louise added to the accumulating understanding of how to build something lasting, not with force or fear or money alone, but with honesty and genuine regard, with treating people as the principals of their own lives rather than as instruments of someone else's purposes. By the fall of 1883, Red Bluff Cattle Company was a going concern by any reasonable measure. The herd was 340 head. The land was healthy. The operation was well-staffed and well-managed. The financial picture was the best it had been since Silas's most productive years, and trending better. Louise's name was known in the cattle trade corridors between Caldwell and Dodge City and Kansas City, and it was known without the qualification she had dealt with in the early months. It was simply known as the name of someone whose operation you could trust and whose word in a cattle deal meant what it said. Oscar had, in the past year, also formalized the equity in the land that she had mentioned in the original partnership agreement, a conversation she had raised, and he had received with the same steady attention he gave everything, and the result of which was that the deed now carried both names, Crawford and Redmond Crawford. It had been his suggestion, actually, to preserve the Redmond in the name, because the Redmond name was on the original deed and in Silas's letters and was part of the story of the land, and he didn't think it should disappear. She had looked at him when he suggested it and said, "You are a remarkably thoughtful man, Oscar Crawford," and he had said, with the very slight dry humor that had been appearing more often in him as the years went on, "I have my moments." The second pregnancy came in the winter of 1883, and this one was less tense, because they had done it before, and the fear of the unknown had been replaced by the known experience of Silas James, who was now a year and a half old, and conducting himself in the world with a confidence and curiosity that his parents found both admirable and occasionally exhausting. The second child arrived in July of 1884, on a hot evening that was cooled by a thunderstorm rolling through just before the birth, so the air in the house afterward was clean and cool and smelled of rain-washed prairie, which seemed appropriate. This time it was a girl, and she was quieter than Silas had been in her first minutes, not less present, but more observational, looking at everything around her with the dark, steady eyes that were clearly going to be gray like her father's, and were already reading the world with an intensity that made Esperanza laugh, and say the child was going to be a lawyer or a general. They named her Clara Louise Crawford. Oscar held his daughter for the first time with a particular quality of care that Louise recognized as having a specific tenderness to it, not more love than he gave Silas but a different shade of it, and when he looked up from the infant's face, his eyes were full. He didn't explain it. She didn't ask him to. Clara had been a name he carried with a weight that she had understood for some time, and giving it now to this new living person was a way of setting that weight down and picking up something lighter, not forgetting, but transforming. She understood this because it was the kind of understanding that came from 2 years of knowing a man completely. The ranch grew. The children grew. The kitchen table where they had first laid out maps and cattle counts became the same table where Silas later learned to read, and Clara later did her arithmetic, where guests ate and problems were solved, and plans were made and ordinary evenings were spent with the lamp burning, and the fire going, and the Kansas night outside doing whatever Kansas nights did in each of their seasons. Duff Coleman was still there at the end of all these years, more grizzled and more attached to the place than anyone would have predicted that first hired day. He had become, in a way that was never formalized or particularly discussed, the children's unofficial uncle, a man who taught Silas to rope at age 4 with a patience that Oscar found both admirable and slightly surprising given Duff's general manner, and who once, when Clara was 2 and had wandered out to the pasture fence by herself on a cold morning, carried her back to the house without alarming anyone, and then stood in the yard for a moment afterward with an expression on his face that suggested He had surprised himself with how much he cared about this family. Tomás and Esperanza added a third child of their own, a boy, and became the neighbors they had been tending toward becoming for several years, building their own small house on the property that Louise had offered them at a price so reasonable it was essentially a gesture, and managing the North operation as if it were their own, because in the ways that mattered it was. In the autumn of 1885, 3 years after Louise had first ridden to Oscar's fence line with a deed and a proposition, Red Bluff hosted its first proper harvest supper, not a formal event but a gathering, the kind that grew naturally from the accumulated goodwill of a place that had been built honestly. Duff and Tomás and Esperanza and their children, the Garrett family from the neighboring ranch, Percy Dodd and his new wife from town, Attorney Briggs, who had become something between a professional resource and a family friend, and two of the new hands who had come on that spring and were turning out to be exactly the kind of reliable men Oscar had identified early, and Louise had confirmed her judgment of through the season. They ate outside in the September evening in the light of lanterns strung between the porch posts and the barn eave, and the food was substantial, and the conversation was the kind that ranged freely over everything and nothing, and Silas Crawford, who was 3.5 years old, and in possession of views on most subjects, sat on the fence rail next to Duff and ate cornbread with the serious focus of a person who had important opinions about cornbread, and Clara, who was one and learning to walk in the specific way that very confident people learn to walk, with decisive steps and minimal concern for the consequences of falling, made her way from adult to adult around the supper table, accepting cornbread and attention in equal measure, and regarding the whole of the evening with those steady gray eyes. Oscar was standing at the edge of the gathering with a cup of coffee, in the particular way he sometimes stood at the edge of things, not apart from them but simply taking them in, the way he took in landscapes, with the precise attention of a man who understood that the quality of any given moment depended partly on your willingness to actually see it. Louise came and stood beside him. "Content," she said. He looked at the gathering, at Duff and Silas on the fence rail, at Esperanza laughing at something Garrett's wife had said, at Clara navigating the grown-up terrain with her characteristic determination, at the lanterns doing their warm work in the September evening, at all of it together against the Kansas sky. "Yes," he said. The word was as simple and as complete as it had always been when he meant it. She leaned into him slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the edge of their life and looked at it, and it was full and good and real in every dimension. The years did their work. The cattle market shifted and they adapted. A drought in 1886 that hit other operations hard was mitigated at Red Bluff by the east water rights that the Henderson parcel had secured, a fact that Louise noted in her journal with a quiet satisfaction that was as much about Silas, about her uncle's care for the land being vindicated in the long term, as it was about her own planning. They sold at good prices through the difficult years because their cattle were healthy and well-sourced, and when the market improved, they were positioned to take advantage of it fully. Oscar's old property, which had been rented and re-rented over the years, was eventually sold to the Missouri couple who had been there from the beginning and had become good neighbors and good people, and the proceeds went into the operation at Red Bluff in a way that felt like a natural completion. All the years of that solitary house and its single occupant flowing finally into the larger, more inhabited life. Silas grew into a boy who was curious about everything and could not be still for long, and who rode at age 5 with the natural ease of someone who had been on horseback before he could walk, which was not far from the truth. Clara grew into a child who was quieter in manner but more fixed in purpose, who could sit with a problem, a broken toy, a mathematical puzzle, a dispute between her and her brother, and work it through to completion with a patience that reminded both her parents, independently and without discussing it, of themselves. A third child, another boy, came in 1887, when Louise was 33 and Oscar was 39. They named him Walter James Crawford Walter for the surveyor whose testimony had saved the land, because it seemed right to carry that name forward, and James again, because Oscar's brother was worth honoring twice. Walter was an easier baby than his siblings had been and a more cheerful child, with his mother's dark hair and a disposition of such good nature that Duff Coleman once said, in what was for him an effusive statement, that young Walter was the most agreeable person at Red Bluff, including the horses, and no one disagreed. Beatrice Harlow, the Colorado correspondent, came to visit in the summer of 1888 with her husband, a former Army engineer named Covington, who had helped her fortify her legal position after Louise's letters, and the four of them spent 3 days in a conversation about land and cattle and law, and the particular experience of building something in this country at this time that was unlike anything Louise had known in years. The conversation of people who understood the same difficult things and had worked through them and come out on the other side with something real to show for it. The Red Bluff Cattle Company grew into the kind of operation that was spoken of in the county with the particular respect reserved for things that had been built honestly and maintained carefully over time. Not the largest operation in Sumner County, there were bigger spreads, but one of the most consistently well-run, which in the long measure was worth more than size. Louise and Oscar sat on the porch of the Red Bluff farmhouse in the evenings when the work was done, as the seasons turned and the years accumulated, and they watched the same Kansas sky that had watched over all of it. The proposals, the cattle drives, the legal battles, the births, the suppers, the first frost of every winter and the first green of every spring. The sky did not change. The land did not change in its essential nature. What changed was everything human on it, the people who loved it and worked it and were shaped by it in return. The September grass was as Silas had described it every year, and every year Louise saw it and thought of her uncle with gratitude and love, and thought of the letter she had opened in a Wichita room and the decision that had followed it, and every year she was more glad of the decision than she had been the year before. Oscar knew she did this. He knew it without being told, in the way that a decade of honest marriage produces a knowledge of a person that goes beyond words and conversation into something quieter and more complete. He would find her on the rise in September, watching the grass, and he would come and stand beside her and sometimes say nothing, and sometimes say one of the practical things about the ranch that needed saying, and she would receive both the silence and the practicality with equal appreciation, because both of them were him and both of them were the language of their life together. In the autumn of 1890, on a Wednesday evening that was notable in no particular way, except for being a fine October night with a full moon rising, Oscar was mending the kitchen chair that had finally given way under the accumulated weight of years, and Louise was at the table writing in her journal, a practice she had maintained continuously since before she had come to Kansas, and that now filled a shelf of its own in the Red Bluff house. Silas, who was 8, was asleep. Clara, who was 6, was asleep. Walter, who was 3, was asleep, though you could never be entirely certain with Walter because he had a gift for appearing asleep while being fully awake and listening. The house was quiet in the way it was only quiet when the children were genuinely down, and the evening work was done, and there was nothing pressing, the kind of quiet that was not empty but full of the life that had been built here, and that was continuing to be built in all its ordinary, extraordinary dailiness. Louise set down her pen and looked up from her journal at Oscar working on the chair, the lamplight warm on his face, his hands as precise with the repair as they were with everything, and she felt the full weight of 8 years sitting in the room with them, not as something heavy but as something substantial, the weight of something real. "I was thinking today about that first morning at your kitchen table," she said, "when I told you about the Red Bluff property," He looked up from the chair. "Were you? You were so careful," she said. "So precise about what you would and wouldn't commit to. I thought this man has very good fences." He considered this. "And now I think," she said carefully, "that you have the best fences of anyone I know. Strong posts, good wire, properly maintained, but you opened the gate." He looked at her for a moment, and the lamplight was warm, and the night outside was the fine October kind, and the children were asleep down the hall, and the cattle were quiet in the pastures, and the deed on the shelf in the next room had 2 names on it. "You proposed first," he said. "Both times." She smiled. "I did. The business partnership and the rest of it. I said yes before you'd asked, which I believe is technically a proposal." He stood up from the repaired chair and crossed to the table and leaned down and kissed her with the ease and warmth of 8 years, and the same quality it had always had, unhurried, genuine, entirely present. "I said yes to both," he said. "You did," she agreed, looking up at him. "Best decision either of us ever made." Outside, the Kansas moon was doing its patient work on the September grass. It was October, actually, but the grass still had that quality of light, or perhaps she had simply learned to see it everywhere now in all seasons, because you learned to see what you had been taught to look for, and Silas had taught her to look. The house was warm. The fire was good. The books were on the shelf. The deed had both names. The children would wake in the morning with their individual energies and their specific natures and their whole futures ahead of them. And she and Oscar would be there for all of it, all the ordinary mornings, all the working days, all the September rises and October evenings and winter fires and spring beginnings. This was what had been given. This was what had been built. It was, by any honest measure, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.